And we're live.
Hi, and welcome to Hershey Area All Things Diversity's event, How Adults Can Support LGBTQ plus Youth. I'm Amy Ziegler with the Hershey Story Museum in Hershey Gardens, and I'm a member of our diversity planning group. Hershey All Things Diversity is a free series of programs to create awareness and promote acceptance and inclusion in our community. It is coordinated by representatives from Derry Township, the Hershey Story Museum, Derry Township School District, Milton Hershey School, the Hershey Company, Penn State Health, Hershey Entertainment Resorts Company, and Hershey Trust Company. These events are also sponsored in part by the Hershey Company, Hershey Entertainment Resorts Company, Milton Hershey School, Penn State Health, and the Giant Company. Tonight, we are pleased to have Lindsey Lughes as our speaker. And throughout the presentation, please put your questions in the chat box on YouTube and we will share them with our speaker. Susan.
Thanks, Amy. It's a pleasure to be with everybody tonight. And it's also a pleasure to hear from Lindsey Lughes about how to understand and support LGBTQ plus youth in your life. This session is going to cover some basic terminology and language, practical recommendations for providing tangible support to LGBTQ plus youth, and local resources for LGBTQ plus youth people, as well as their parents and their teachers and other adults in their life. So to introduce Lindsey, she is the former Director of Training and Education for the LGBT Center of Central PA and previously served as the Director of Youth Programs for the same organization. After a decade in Pennsylvania, she returned to her home state of North Carolina to serve as the Executive Director of an LGBTQ plus organization there. She has been an educator in various capacities and on a number of different subjects, but has worked on LGBTQ plus rights for 15 years. Lindsey has used her passion to conduct dozens of workshops with specialization in transgender identities, terminology, and best practices. Lindsey is also a certified trainer by the Transgender Training Institute. Lindsey, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Amy. So my name is Lindsey. My pronouns are she, her, and I have a special guest with me tonight. This is my child.
My name is Dylan. My pronouns are they, them.
So Dylan is 12 years old, and I was sharing with Susan and Amy before we began that they've been presenting with me for a long time. And typically these happen when they're at school, but since they were home with me tonight, I said they could sit in and participate. So Dylan is here as a representative of the LGBTQ plus youth that we'll be talking about tonight. So I have a quick presentation that I'm going to share with you this evening, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're just going to go over a few things, and as I mentioned, and as Susan just mentioned, please put any questions you may have in the chat. I am always excited to answer questions and hope that this can be participatory. I'm going to go over a lot of material relatively quickly, but please know, I say at every training and every workshop and every talk that this is the beginning of a conversation. This is not the end of a conversation. So if you're here joining us and viewing this tonight, or of course, as it stays up on the page in the future, please know that there are a number of local resources to you, the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania being one. The LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania has been running a group called Common Roads, which is for LGBTQ plus youth, since 1993. So it's been around for quite some time. They have obviously moved to a primarily virtual model, though they are bringing back some in-person programming. And all of that information can be found on the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania website, which I'll of course share with you at the end of this. So please know that some of this might be overwhelming or confusing, or some of it may all sound great now, but as you move about the rest of the week, you may think, I have a question about this. So please know that we're always happy and eager to answer any questions you may have. When we talk about LGBTQ plus terminology, we know that a lot of people refrain from discussing LGBTQ plus ideas, feelings, talking about sexual orientation, talking about gender identity and expression, because it may feel taboo or like they're afraid to say the wrong thing. Language moves really, really quickly in so many ways, particularly with LGBTQ plus identities. This happens for a number of reasons. One of the biggest reasons being that the youth are connected on social media, and they're connected in ways that they've never been connected before. And they're finding people who share identities with them, and they're finding language that feels more appropriate to them. And they're finding language that they can, evolve into terms that matter to them. So I never want that to overwhelm anybody. I want people just to know that we just want to listen for and respect a person's self-identified terminology. I could share with you a list of common terms that are used, and I'll use some of those throughout this presentation. But rather than kind of start off with a glossary or summary of things, the biggest takeaway is just to remember that it's always appropriate to ask somebody how you can best affirm them when they're sharing language, particularly with language that you're not familiar with. So this topic is really, really relevant these days for so many reasons. One of the biggest ones being that as of right now, there have been over 300 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced nationwide. And this photo is courtesy of Human Rights Campaign. HRC does a lot of great work in tracking and giving action steps around anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. Pennsylvania has actually had a couple of things pending, and they don't seem to be going anywhere, but it's important to know that right now these are very tricky times across the board. I mean, I think that virtually anything we could talk about, any topic we could come up with, we know that these are really challenging times. Things are feeling very polarized and very politicized, and transgender youth take the brunt of this when we're talking about anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. The bill that was pending in Pennsylvania was particularly targeting transgender youth playing sports and trying to mandate that youth must play sports with the gender they were assigned at birth. Obviously, I'm sure you can guess my take on that is it's very harmful. If anybody has any questions about that, we certainly can discuss that. But right now, the states that are in green on this map are states where bills have been introduced. The states that are in pink on this map, and again, this is from the HRC, are states where bills have been signed into law. So for instance, you can see that Alabama is one of these places. Just last week, Alabama passed the most restrictive medical bill that we've seen yet that targeted transgender youth attempting to seek transition-related care. Now, transition-related care for minors is typically nothing more than therapy, occasionally hormonal suppression, or what's sometimes called hormone blockers or pubertal suppression, which is a very widely understood, very commonly used method of prescription medications that are given from an endocrinologist. This is considered an extremely safe practice. It's not just considered an extremely safe practice. The American Pediatric Association and many other major medical organizations say this is best practice when working with transgender youth. So this appears to be and feels like another situation and case where politicians are way overstepping the bounds of decisions that patients and families and social workers and therapists are making in conjunction with doctors. This is always something that's done in a very holistic team when there's a decision made to begin a youth on hormonal suppression. It's done in conjunction again with social workers, with therapists, with endocrinologists, of course, with the parents being on board. And so this is something that then makes that a felony to do so, and it's really harmful. And I share this really mostly to share that this is a really relevant topic right now, that always it's important for us to affirm people in from marginalized communities and with marginalized identities. But these days are feeling scary and challenging and hard for so many LGBTQ plus people, anybody who has an LGBTQ plus family member, child, et cetera. It can feel extremely overwhelming. So never has it been more relevant. So I appreciate you all being here tonight and having this conversation. Sometimes we're tempted to share things like this, and it's important to share things like this. Now, I don't know if everybody here knew that there were over 300 bills introduced since the start of 2022, right? So as we learn things like this, it can feel very overwhelming. It's like, does everybody know this is happening? I mean, this is really a big deal. Sometimes there are things that come across the news, like, as I mentioned, Alabama and the healthcare situation in Alabama, or violence against transgender folks. And so sometimes when we share this on social media, one of the best things we can do to help support LGBTQ plus youth is to share these things with action steps. The action steps can look like a petition to sign. It can look like donating to a fundraiser, and there are tons and tons of reputable fundraisers out there. Of course, there are tons of organizations. Locally, I'll reiterate that there's the LGBT Center of Central PA. There's also Alder, ALDER, Alder Health Services, which is an LGBTQ healthcare provider that serves the Hershey-Harrisburg area. And they do incredible work to help LGBTQ plus folks and people in the community who are HIV positive, et cetera. And of course, sharing information. There are lots of protests and demonstrations. And doing things like being able to show up on the Capitol steps. While I recognize that that's not something that everybody's able to do, has access to do, or even the desire to do, sharing the information about that can sometimes be such a show of solidarity. Action steps can also look like fun things, right? They don't always have to be just kind of the doom and gloom. Let's let our legislators know that we're not okay with what's happening, or let's all show up with our signs. It can also look like sharing exciting, hopeful things that are happening. The fact that Pride events are coming back, and that there will be Pride events happening all throughout Central PA in the next several months. Sharing information on that, sharing information on ways, incredible things that LGBTQ plus organizations are doing, like GLOW, GLO, GLOW Harrisburg, is a program that was founded as a part of the LGBT Center of Central PA and now operates, really somewhat autonomously, but still in close relationship with the LGBT Center. But it's a program for LGBTQ plus youth and young adults of color. So they do everything from helping provide housing information, therapy resources, providing supportive services like that, to also providing HIV testing, STI testing, counseling on safer sex education, and of course offer all their services free of charge, as well as running a food pantry and doing so many other things. So GLOW Harrisburg is a great organization to be in the loop with and to share the things they're doing. So action steps are so important. Sometimes, especially when things feel complicated, we can get kind of in the quagmire, just feel like, oh my gosh, where do we go from here? What do we do? And so being able to share action steps is a really vital way that we can all participate and keep things with an eye towards hope, right? I think through everything, and especially through these really dark and challenging days, it's important that we remember that we can still have hope, that there's hope, there's wonderful, wonderful people, everybody viewing this tonight, you're here because you care, and there are people who care so much. And it's important that LGBTQ plus youth know how much people are willing to show up for them. The genderbread person I have on here for a few reasons. One, because a lot of you have probably seen this before. It's from a website called It's Pronounced Metrosexual, up at the top. The genderbread person is a fun, as I pulled up this presentation, Dylan shared with me that it's actually hanging in their science class at their middle school. The genderbread person is a fun, colorful, easy printable. This is not the greatest resolution, but you can find it in an easy downloadable format on It's Pronounced Metrosexual. It's a fun, easy thing to print and hang up. It sparks conversation. It has a little QR code at the bottom for read more, and any youth in your life will know how to access that more than likely. And it really shows the 4 parts of a person's identity that so often are conflated, right? So it starts with gender identity, which is notated by the brain. And that's how we see ourselves. That's our deep internal sense of our own identity, our own gender. Everybody has a gender identity. Most people's gender identity, we know now, is formed between about 18 months of age and 4 or 5 years of age. And that certainly doesn't mean that all very small people have access to language, have access to share with us who they are. It also doesn't mean that if people are not aware of their gender identity at that age, that, say well into their 30s, 40s, 70s, they realize that their gender identity is incongruent with the gender they were assigned at birth. So that would be somebody who identifies as transgender. That's still perfectly valid, right? A lot of people don't have access to language or even really space much to think about this. Gender expression is notated just around the little genderbread person there. Gender expression is how we convey ourselves, how we want people to experience us. It's how we demonstrate our gender through our actions, our dress, our behavior. And gender expression can sometimes be congruent with gender identity. Sometimes it tells us a lot about a person's identity, but not always. For a number of reasons like safety and other various reasons, there are reasons why a person's gender expression may differ from their gender identity. Biological sex, I don't love that phrasing, but it's the language we're going to use right now. Biological sex is another component of this. And biological sex just refers to things like chromosomes, hormones, and of course, secondary sex characteristics, etc. Now, biological sex, as you see, is also on a spectrum. Now, if you ever go into the comments section on any article about transgender folks, I don't advise doing that. But if you do that, you will always certainly see people yelling about, there's men and there's women, there's male, there's female, there's XX, XY. And we know that even that's not true. You're actually as likely to know somebody born intersex as you are to know somebody born with red hair. And I use that statistic because you can see on the screen, I'm a redhead. Dylan's hair is dyed, but they are also redhead. And I always like dropping that statistic because, if people often go, wait a minute, but I know you, right? We comprise about the same percentage of the population. About 1 in 100 people are born with red hair, but 1 in 100 people are born intersex. So very likely, somebody who was born intersex. They may not know it themselves because we're not always testing for these things. But it's important to know that even biological sex does not happen in a strict binary. All of these things are happening, and sometimes we think of it as a spectrum. Some things like gender identity can be even broader than that, than just a spectrum. And then lastly, we have sexual orientation. So the LGB part of the LGBTQ plus acronym. Sexual orientation. So, and again, that has that kind of on a spectrum as well. The most common ways we hear, the most common things we hear, of course, lesbian, gay, bisexual. So that's somebody who's attracted to people of their same gender or other genders. And that is who we're attracted to physically, spiritually, emotionally. So each one of these components operates independently of each other. And that can feel really confusing and overwhelming, particularly when you recognize that means there are infinite combinations, more combinations than we could ever gather or grasp, and that's okay, because this goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. This can feel really overwhelming, but the important part is just that we know that it's okay to not know it all. It's just important that we know how to ask people how we can best affirm that. But the genderbread person I share as a teaching tool because I think it is so fun and colorful and it catches people's attention and it's easily printable off the internet, and it's something that you could always have hanging up on display, and it's also something that's a good teaching tool and can give people a chance to think. It really gives people a chance to think like, wow, wait, so there's so many different ways that a person could express themselves, and again, all these things operate independently of each other. Visual cues and representation, going back to printing out the genderbread person, are such an important way we can show LGBTQ plus youth that we're here, that we're showing up for them, that we're affirming them. I used a picture of the safe space sticker that GLSEN, and GLSEN.org is a wonderful resource. GLSEN is a resource for schools and educators, but they have these safe space stickers along with the safe space curriculum that can be easily printed and taught in schools to teachers, to school counselors. The center offers some of this as well. The LGBT Center of Central PA offers some trainings on this as well. But these safe space stickers, people can receive at the end of a safe space training, and they're very inexpensive. I think they also have them printable as well. And the safe space sticker is something that you can put up in a doorway, in a classroom, in a church, in the corner of a sanctuary window or anything like that. And it's just a way of letting people know that they're in a space. It's relatively small, but people see it and it matters. It's actually been shown time and time again that LGBTQ plus youth who are in spaces where they see constant and regular visual reminders have significantly better mental health outcomes. So that can look like having a flag hanging up at your home, particularly as we move into June and Pride Month. It's a great time to dust off those rainbow flags and put them up. And speaking of flags, the Progress Pride flag is the current best practice flag to use. There are so many rainbow flags out there and so many different reasons why some of them, so many different pride flags, period. Pride flags for all different identities. There's any identity you can pick up has its own flag. But the Progress Pride flag was born of the original multicolored rainbow flag, which came about in 1978 in San Francisco. There was a transgender pride flag, which a number of people have probably seen. It looks like the first three stripes in that chevron, so white, pink, and blue stripes. It was designed in 1999. And then artist Daniel Quasar, who himself is identifies, I believe, as non-binary, they reimagined this flag. And they thought there has to be a better representation to show where we are as a current movement. As I mentioned, things change really fast. The LGBTQ plus movement is very dynamic. The flag's black and brown stripes that were added are a reminder that of the marginalization that LGBTQ communities of color face. And Quasar reshaped the flag into the chevron to represent the need for forward movement. So as we mentioned, it's a very dynamic movement, but we always want to think about it as moving forward. And particularly, I think it's interesting the way they designed it with the black and brown stripes kind of leading the way here. And so remembering that we always need to center the voices of those most marginalized among us. So that would be, particularly Black transgender women, women who are living at the very dangerous intersection of racism in our culture, transphobia in our culture, sexism in our culture. And so really remembering to uplift and amplify the voices of transgender women of color, Black transgender women, and all the various ways we can do that, which we'll discuss. So that created the Progress Pride flag. Very, very easy to find online. Daniel Quasar said that they wanted to shift the focus and emphasis to what is important in our current community climate. They wanted to make sure that they were drawing attention to the need to center and support Black and brown, queer, and trans people. Now, I want to make a note about Daniel Quasar's use of the word queer. So as a lot of folks probably know, in the LGBTQ plus acronym, which we could spell, it can go on and on and on and on, but it's often shortened to LGBTQ plus, often that Q does stand for queer. And I want to do a quick note about queer because I took this quote directly from them, obviously, but I want to make a quick note about queer. A lot of people, if we were in a room together, I'd ask you all by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with queer as a slur? And a lot of people have heard queer as a slur as a very derogatory thing. And that can be true. It is also reclamation language. A number of LGBTQ plus people, particularly LGBTQ plus youth, have reclaimed that word, have adopted it, have taken it on for their own. And it's almost become shorthand to mean anybody who falls under this LGBT plus umbrella. Dylan's nodding along. They concur. When I've got my preteen agreeing with me, I am doing this right. So queer has become kind of a catch-all term. Queer indicates that there are so many ways a person can be LGBTQ plus. It doesn't necessarily just mean that a person is transgender or gay or both or any variation or fluid in any form or fashion, that their sexuality is fluid, that their gender identity is fluid, so many different things. So queer can become a nice catch-all phrase. I also like queer because it can be seen as, again, kind of an inter-community conversation, inter-community language. That reclamation language can be really powerful. So I say that because when you're working with LGBTQ plus youth, you may hear them refer to themselves or the others or their peers as queer. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they've got some internalized up. It could, but likely doesn't mean they've got some internalized up that they're working on. It often means that they're really actually kind of embracing the whole of all these identities. So when a young person comes out, we're gonna do some quick do's and don'ts for when a young person comes out. Obviously, the first thing you can do is congratulate them. That is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Asking questions. There are some questions that are really appropriate to ask, of course, some questions that are less appropriate to ask, which is why asking some questions is also in our don't column. Of course, when somebody comes out to us, we want to make sure that we're not making it about us, especially for those of us who identify as LGBTQ+. It can be so easy. It almost seems like a sense of solidarity and camaraderie to say, oh my gosh, I remember when I was coming out in 1984, we kind of want to go into our stories, but it's really important to keep the moment and the focus on the person who is, this young person, what they're disclosing. Obviously, this is kind of a given, but just to reiterate, we would never, of course, try to talk them out of who they are. Now that seems pretty obvious when we're talking about things like if somebody says, hey, I have been thinking about it and I'm gay, and that's, where I am right now. Well, that seems pretty obvious. Some of the less obvious things are when somebody says something like, I'm asexual, which may be a lesser understood sexual orientation. Asexuality is extremely valid. A person who identifies as asexual may mean that they have little or no sexual attraction towards anybody. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't desire romantic relationships or aren't in romantic relationships. That doesn't really tell us anything other than that is how that person feels about their sexual orientation. But those are the times when people start to say, well, can you know that? I mean, you're 14 years old, or things like that. Very well-meaning conversations. We always want to remember that we want to kind of go back to just congratulating and affirming. Thank you for sharing that with me. Some questions that we can ask that are really affirming are things like, how can I support you? Thanks for sharing that with me. How can I support you through this right now? Asking who else knows. Now, in this case, we're going to ask who else knows because we want to always honor and respect their privacy. So if you have a family member who comes out to you, let's go with an example. If your 14-year-old cousin says, hey, I've been thinking about it and I think I'm a lesbian. Again, we go, oh, thank you so much for sharing that with me. How can I support you? She may share some things, and then you say, and who else knows about this? Is there anybody else in the family you'd like to know? Or is there any way to help you navigate this? And that's to remember that you may be the only person this person's come out to. You may be the first person they've come out to. You may be one of 2, 3, but it's always their business and their private time. Their ability to share that with people will come when they're ready to. Asking about names and pronouns that you like to use, particularly when we're talking about gender identity. If somebody discloses that they're transgender or non-binary, you can say, what name or pronouns would you like me to use? Notice that I don't say preferred. We're looking for more affirming, right? We're looking to affirm people. And again, when they share the name and pronouns, we want to kind of go back to, and who else knows this? Who else are you comfortable with knowing that information? Is it okay if I share this with so-and-so, or is this just between us? And then honor that. Sometimes there's talking about, so obviously when a young person comes out, so a young person coming out of the closet, however that's worded, is a disclosure. There's also a phrase called outing people. That's forcing somebody out without them wanting to be out. And that can be a real safety issue. Always trust that this person knows the best way to navigate their own life, even when they're young. Because if they say, no, I can't tell my mom, there's no way she'd accept this. And you say, no, but I know your mom, your mom's great about this stuff. You can certainly say to them, oh, it's interesting. I'd like to talk through why you feel that way, because that's not the experience I've had with your mom. But trust that if they're not ready to disclose that, they're not ready to disclose that. And the best thing you can do is go back to that first question of how can I support you? Some questions that we don't want to ask or say are, what? We never want to act like this is shocking information. along with not acting like it's shocking information, additionally is not acting like, oh, of course we knew this. A lot of people are tempted to say things like that when somebody comes out, particularly if they've suspected it, right? Say, oh, well, that just makes sense. Sometimes that can be a really painful thing for folks to hear because they may not have known that about themselves yet. And so it's also an implication that I know you better than you know you. I called this years ago. And it can start to bring up things like, stereotypes or what vibe am I putting off? Is there something that I'm doing? It really makes somebody question. So, always just respond as if this is brand new information to you, but also not shocking information. Thanks so much for sharing. Who else knows is also on here because there's an element of that can come across as shameful. Oh, well, who else knows? We don't want this to come across as, oh, this is something we have to manage, right? We don't want our pastor at church to find out how will they respond. We want who else knows to be an affirming question. Who else knows? Who else are you comfortable with sharing this with? And how can I help you navigate this? And lastly, of course, we never want to ask about sex. And that goes along with a lot of other invasive personal questions as well, particularly for folks who are transgender. It can often get invasive questions about how they feel about their body. Trust that if we're fostering open lines of communication, we're creating open lines of communication, that they will share this with us in time. And the more receptive we are, and the more present we stay with them, the more likely they are to continue to share with us. We talked very briefly about pronouns because sharing our pronouns, offering pronouns, asking pronouns is one of the easiest ways we can affirm not just LGBTQ plus youth, but all LGBTQ plus people in our community. Pronouns, again, as I mentioned, a lot of things have become really politicized lately. Interestingly enough, a grammatical part of speech has been one of them, right? Pronouns have become seen as really a politicized topic. But pronouns are so easy. As we mentioned, as I started this, I said, my name is Lindsey. My pronouns are she, her. Dylan shared their name and their pronouns. And it's just very quick. We offered up our pronouns. There are places we can include our pronouns that make it so easy for other people to share their pronouns with us, particularly if their pronouns are not something that we're expecting. In introductions, as I mentioned just now, and our email signatures, kind of parenthetically under our name is a great place to do it, in personal and professional email. On name tags, leaving a space to write pronouns, or better yet, offering up pronoun stickers is a really easy way because some people have never thought about their pronouns. And so they see the blank, and I've seen people do things like, very well-meaning, but people will do things like write like straight, or they feel like confused, like, why do I need to disclose this? But offering a variety of he, him, they, them, she, her, and maybe possibly some blank stickers as well. People use what we call neo pronouns, which are newer pronouns. Those aren't commonly used, are they?
I think so. One of the situations that I've seen throughout some of my friends is they have come out with neo pronouns, but after a few months they realize that no one uses them, so they kind of tend to hide back and go into they them pronouns again.
So what Dylan's pointing out is that neo pronouns are commonly things like Z, XE, Zer is another one, ZER. There are so many of them, so many different ways. And so I don't tend to talk too much about neo pronouns in trainings, particularly when we have this kind of time, because we can get really in the weeds with this. But it's also important to remember that we may have a conversation a year from now and I may say, all right, y'all got to get on board. It's time for us to learn neo pronouns. This might be a very different conversation. But at present time, just allowing people the option to write out their pronouns if they're different from what we would expect. Of course, having spaces on forms and social media bios. Social media bios matter so much because when only people who are maybe transgender or non-binary or gender non-conforming in some form or fashion are the ones listing their pronouns, that it becomes a really othering thing, right? That it becomes really obvious, like, oh, this is somebody who's transgender. If we all collectively, as people who are aspiring allies to LGBTQ plus folks, include our pronouns in our social media bios, that can go a long way towards helping make it a space and a way for everybody to do that. I like to say that too, because I think people sometimes are waiting for the permission to do this, right? It can feel a little bit like, well, I want to do that, but I didn't be silly because people all know my pronouns, they know what they are. But it's really important to say that this is a wonderful way to help support folks whose pronouns may be different from what we're expecting. And if we need to know pronouns, and we do, it's important to ask. And asking can be done so simply. Just was wondering what pronouns you use or how you'd like them to address you. Particularly, again, if we're in the middle of somebody's disclosing to us, just want to make sure I'm using the correct language to refer to. And that goes, kind of across the board. But it says, or better yet, just share yours. When you share your pronouns, you give space for other people to share theirs. The one thing we never want to do is only ask pronouns of folks that we're unclear about. So we don't want to look at somebody and say, I'm not quite sure, this person looks kind of gender nonconforming. Let me ask them what their pronouns are and not ask anybody else in the rest of the group. I mean, that's a really kind of othering thing to do. Youth are transgender youth, non-binary youth, and even cisgender youth, so youth who do identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, are changing up gender presentation, gender expression all the time in really exciting ways, figuring out ways that are most comfortable to them. So again, remembering that expression never tells us anything about identity or sexual orientation, operates independently. So we want to, across the board, be always kind of asking and affirming this. And degendering our language too is another really important thing we can do. So degendering our language looks like not gendering it as often as we possibly can. So for instance, we have some helpful things here, like he or she can just say they. I can't tell you how often I receive things home from my children's school that says, your son or daughter will. And I think it would have been so much easier to say your child will. Not only is it shorter, a little more succinct, a little cleaner, but it also removes gendered language altogether, right? Takes that out. So this isn't to say that we can't use these things when they're applicable. And I want to be really clear about that sometimes these things are applicable. If you are meeting with your group of fellow moms and you know that everybody in that group identifies as a mom and they, that is your thing, and you say, hey, how you doing tonight, moms? Well, that's still appropriate. We're certainly not saying that gendered language can't exist or shouldn't exist. It's just simply to say that we're addressing a group of people or a lot of people. If we see a group of folks that we want to remember that not everybody might identify as a lady and gentleman or mom and dad, or that we're also making assumptions about things. One of the examples I give is how often I got to eat with colleagues of mine, who many of whom are transgender, gender nonconforming, and the servers will come over to the table and they'll say, "Hi, good afternoon, ladies. What can I get for you?" And every time, often they're wrong. It's not a table of ladies. They're making an assumption there. But every time I think, it'd been so much easier to say, "Hey, friends, what can I get for you today?" Or "Hey, folks." So degendering our language is not just a way to be more inclusive, but it's also actually an easier way to just have some best practice language. And this is a little bit trickier, right? So this is, when we're talking about language, this is a really important thing to think about. But this is something that's part of a much larger training on trans identities that we certainly hopefully can have these conversations. But I did want to share this with you tonight, just because we want to have some shared language. So when we say things like real sex or real gender, we want to remember that what we're saying is sex assigned at birth or gender assigned at birth. A person is their gender. Remember, gender is notated by the brain, right? So a person is who they're telling us they are, right? That is who they are. They may have had a gender assigned on them. We all had a gender assigned on us at birth, but all of us were born. The doctors took a look at our bodies and said to our parents, "Congratulations, you have a beautiful baby girl, a beautiful baby boy," whatever the case may be, that was assigned to us. As we came to grow and know ourselves, for some of us, that was congruent. So that would be folks who identify as cisgender or not transgender. For some folks, as they came to grow and know and understand themselves, that was not the case. Those are folks who are transgender. But regardless of what their designation was at birth, they always are really the gender that they are declaring they are. And then other things in here are just kind of grammatical. But I do want to make a note about where we say sex change, the surgery, preoperative, postoperative. Medically transitioning would be the way to say that, but it's really important to note that only about 20% of folks who are transgender will ever undergo any kind of surgery, right? It's actually not very common at all. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them being that it can be very expensive and time consuming. They need to be able to take the time off of work to do so. They need to have family and friends who can care for them. They also need to be medically well enough to undergo a surgery, but also a lot of transgender folks just don't desire it, and that's perfectly valid too. So I have that on here because I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that happens, and particularly a question that happens with youth, right? Or questions where people are asking like, well, did you know if you wanted to have a surgery, or is that how you feel? And if a youth says something along the lines of, "No, I don't want to have surgery," people start to become a little bit more dismissive and think, well, maybe they're not actually transgender, or how they're telling you that they identify. And sexual orientation is the way that we always want to word things, like sexual preference. And lastly, we just want to remember to affirm. There's never anything wrong with telling a young person, "You're perfect just as you are." Affirming LGBTQ plus youth in every way they come to us, and every way they disclose who they are, even if it's something that we're not familiar with, even if it's something that feels a little bit out of what we've ever experienced. We want to remember the resources we have, the access we have to education, to Googling things, to a lot of great websites. My personal favorite is genderspectrum.org. And Gender Spectrum is a wonderful website, particularly for anybody who works with youth in schools, where you can put in so many different categories and look, for everything from people who work in social services fields to educators to clergy to all kinds of folks. Genderspectrum.org is a great way to affirm youth. And so remind them, thank you for sharing with me. You are perfect just as you are. You're loved, you're accepted, and I'm going to do everything I can to better affirm you, to better, to support you. And that may mean that I have to do some research, and that may mean that I have to talk it over. And I don't think any youth, I think Dylan would agree, I don't think any youth is expecting everybody to say right away, like, yeah, oh, absolutely, I get this 100%. This makes perfect sense to me. They're just expecting us to show up and care. And of course, you're here tonight because you're showing up and care. Oh, and I wanted to close with a picture. So Dylan happened to be here tonight, so you see. But this is our little thank you slide for the package that Hershey sent to the Hershey products as a thank you gift for us being here tonight. And I just really wanted to let you know how much we value everything you do. Those are my youth. And so with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and see what kind of questions we have coming in. Because as I mentioned, I threw a lot of information at you, and Dylan is motioning to me that he has something he would like to say. They have something they would like to say. So
okay, so something I wanted to point out real quick, and this has to do with affirming transgender youth, is a lot of times when people meet trans people, like transgender people, they will say, well, what's in your underwear? Or like things like that. And things like, well, what's your sex assigned at birth? They always try to ask, well, what were you before you came out? Which is something that you should never do.
Right, that's a good point, Dylan.
That's something that if they want to share with you, they can.
Right. So I think that hopefully, again, we're talking about adults talking with you. So hopefully we're not asking the underwear questions. But I think that to your point, asking people like, well, what gender were you assigned at birth? Or what did your name used to be? That's a really common question. What was your name before? So I think those are some things that happen, some questions that happen that can feel really invasive and inappropriate, right? So thanks for that point, Dylan. So I'll toss it over to Susan and Amy if you have any questions coming in that I can answer.
Well, thank you so much. That's really wonderful information. And we love that Dylan is here and participating with you. That's great. So we have a question. Can a person's gender identity or sexuality change throughout their life?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that we know that there are, we talk about everything operating kind of on a spectrum and everything operating in kind of a fluid fashion. We know that no part of our identity is necessarily fixed in the sense that we understand it all completely, right? So a person may come out at, well, I'll say as Dylan did at a very young age, at 6 years old, came out as, do you want to share that?
When I was 6 years old, I came out as a trans man. But
boy, he was 6, but yes.
But as I grew up a little bit, and even like a year or two ago, I decided that, or not really decided, I realized that I was not a trans man. I was non-binary. So.
Non-binary. So I think Dylan, you would describe that as not identifying strongly as a man or a woman?
Non-binary is more of a neutral. It's not really, they don't feel comfortable with any, not label, but gender. They don't feel strongly like they're a man or a woman. They're just kind of in between.
And I would also say for non-binary folks, one of the things I would say about non-binary identities is that if I lined up 10 non-binary people for a panel right now, and we asked all 10 of them to answer what not being non-binary means to them, we likely could get 6, 7, 8, possibly 10 different answers. And it can be very personal, but it's typically somebody whose gender feels something outside of the binary male or female. Anywhere, again, it was notated as a spectrum on the genderbread person, but it also could be referred to as like a constellation. You have people who don't identify as any gender or maybe feel stronger one way or another. But I think that what Dylan's referring to is something that they've experienced on their own kind of exploration, their own journey. And Dylan also has a lot of access to language. I've been doing this work since they were a bitty child, so they've had a lot of access to this language. Not everybody has access to this language. So it's perfectly appropriate that somebody in their 30s, or, as I mentioned, or 40s or 50s or so on, may start to come to understand and know themselves better. I can't tell you how often I've done workshops with particularly older folks who said things like, well, if I would have known that was an option when I was young, maybe I'm non-binary too, or maybe I'm bisexual, or maybe I didn't know that was an option. And I always say, well, it can still be an option for you now. I mean, it's never too late to come into an understanding or awareness. So that would be around, again, coming into an understanding, awareness, accessing language. But as far as things just changing, absolutely that can happen as well. People can find themselves in spaces or places where things just start to fit and feel better. I used the example of asexuality earlier, and one of the things I was thinking about is somebody who maybe 30 years ago identifies presently as asexual, maybe 30 years ago wouldn't have had any understanding of what they were feeling, right? Everybody tells them, oh, well, especially as you move into teenage years, oh, your hormones are gonna go wacky, you're gonna, wanna have sex, and they're not feeling that. They're not feeling that urge, they're not feeling sexually attracted to people. They probably would have thought there's something really wrong with me, right? A person who has access to the internet as they do now, social media, things like, well, what are you on today? TikTok? I don't know what the youth are using. These various things that they're on, they're able to find people who feel and think like them. They're able to read the discourse and have conversations. There's so many clubs in schools. I know a lot of the schools in Derry Township, I think maybe all the high schools, maybe most of the middle schools in Derry Township have GSAs or Gay Straight Alliance or Gender and Sexuality Alliance, whatever they refer to it as. Clubs for LGBTQ plus youth to be able to go there and find people who feel like them. And so anyway, I say all this to say that there are so many, that nothing has to be static, but also so much of this is about just an exploration and finding things that feel right to us.
Well, Lindsey and Dylan, this has been incredible. And Dylan, I'm so glad that you're able to join tonight. This is really great to hear from your perspective too. And I made a note of something you said that I thought was so important. You said, first you said, I decided, and then you said, no, I realized. And I thought that's kind of a neat distinction, for youth who are watching this or parents who have youth who might be considering themselves identifying in the LGBTQ plus space, talk a little bit about your journey. I mean, you obviously, like your mom said, have tons of resources, but a lot of kids don't. Like how did you come to realize, in your journey, how you identified, and what advice would you give to other youth who are maybe struggling to figure it out? Because you don't have to choose, right? It can just sort of be an evolution and part of your journey.
One thing that I've said to a lot of my friends, because I have been talking with my friends and other people who are questioning their sexuality or their gender, is one, you don't have to put a label on it. You do not have to come out one day and be like, oh yeah, I'm gay. It doesn't work like that. I mean, it could, but it usually doesn't. Usually it's a long process of, wait, am I gay? Wait, maybe I'm bi. No. I'm straight. No, I'm definitely gay. It's a long process of that. And you don't have to know it immediately. It's okay to be questioning for weeks, months, years, decades. It's okay to question and just not really be sure about what is happening in your life, Another thing is don't feel pressured to come out, is one thing, and don't pressure people to come out. I think we touched base on this a little bit. Don't out people, but also when people come out, don't be like, well, I knew that. But if you do feel like you know it, don't mention it, because as my mom said, they probably won't know yet, or they will be in that questioning area and they don't want to say anything because they're like, well, if I don't know, maybe people shouldn't know. And I think knowing all of this helped me and a lot of my friends out with coming out, and having resources is always number one best practice. Is if someone does come out, help them with resources. If you know any, be like, do you have anywhere that you know for a fact you'll be safe? Do you have anywhere where you know that there are people that you can talk to that will relate to you or that you feel comfortable talking to? Their number one best thing for youth is kind of not help, but knowing that there's someone else that understands you, knowing that someone else out there is going through what you're going through. And that's part of the reason, one of the reasons why it helped me so much when I was coming out, is because my mom just started her job at the LGBT Center of Central PA. So I would go to her work and I would see all of these people. I'm like, wow, maybe I'm like them. And that's definitely something that all youth should have. If it's a small little group at a church nearby, or if it is an LGBT center, which there are so many LGBT centers around the world and America. There is one in at least every state, I believe.
And also, I'd add to that too, there's the Trevor Project, which is Trevor Project is a really great resource. And Trevor Project has a lot of online chat spaces, text lines, and things like that. It's often thought of as just being a resource for youth who are in crisis, but it can be a really good resource for youth who are just trying to find out information as well.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I share? I think you're okay with me. I'm pretty sure
you can share whatever.
I think I know what they're comfortable with me sharing, but Dylan asserted from a very young age that they were not a boy or a girl. And I had no idea what that meant. I thought I was raising this tiny little feminist kid who was like, you're not going to label me. I'm just, what does it matter? And then at about 5 or 6 years of age, Dylan said, was really strongly asserting, I'm not a girl, I'm not a girl. And I said, okay, at this point now, I've started working with folks with trans identities. I'm learning a little more. I said, okay, all right, I've got this. So you're a boy, he, him pronouns. You want to change your name? And I felt like pretty comfortable, like, all right, I've prepared for this. I know what to do. And then Dylan was still saying to me, it was still obvious that didn't really feel right to you either.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I'm not sure if I'm a boy either. And for a while, like 5 or 6 years, I went with he, they pronouns, which is one thing that I should mention is some people aren't just he, him, or she, her, or they, them. A lot of people are a combination. There's more than one pronoun that feels right to them. So for a while.
Explain that, because I think people might be confused about like a he them kind of a situation or a she them. Like what does that mean to you, Dylan?
When people are coming out, especially, and also just people, there are some people that are like, I feel comfortable with he, him, but also I like they, them. I like both of them. If you could use both, you don't have to alter every other sentence, but you also just like not using, I'm going to use me as an example, not just using he, him, or not just using they, them, which obviously I just use they, them now, but don't use just he, him, or don't use just they, them. And like I said, you don't have to alter it every other sentence, but it's nice just to break out a little bit and but only do that with pronouns that they're comfortable with using. So don't be like, well, this person uses he, they, which means I can also use she for them because they don't care about what people call them. Which there are people who don't care about their pronouns. They feel comfortable with any pronouns. In fact, my little sibling, they feel comfortable with any pronouns. They were the one in the picture. They don't care. They don't care. And there are people like that, but don't assume that everyone with like he, they, or she, they pronouns are like that. Most of the time, they just want to use she and they, but they don't only want to use she, her, and they don't only want to use they, them. So,
and kind of to your point earlier, Dee, when you're talking about, they were talking about neo-pronouns earlier, like different pronouns, and Dylan said sometimes people have tried using neo-pronouns and then nobody does it, so they go back to using they, them. And it's funny to me that I never thought there'd be a time we'd see the singular they being the like easier option, right? We're opting for that, but I think that is kind of where we are sometimes with this. But I think they, them pronouns are similar. I think a lot of times, like when you were in school and you wanted to use they, them pronouns when you were in 3rd grade, I knew that the school probably wasn't going to understand that. More schools are now, but I was worried they weren't going to. So I knew that she, her was very comfortable to you. You did not want to be referred to as a girl. And so he, him was the pronoun of choice over she, her. And I would say to people, I think that they've just chosen the gender of least resistance. Like it was the one that was going to be easiest for the school to understand, though not necessarily the one that was most affirming. But the story that I often tell about Dylan being at the LGBT Center of Central PA and meeting young folks, teenagers, adolescents who use they, them pronouns. And Dylan said to one of them, why do you say they, them for you? Why do you say they pronouns? And the person explained, you were 7 years old. And the person said, well, I don't really identify as a boy or a girl. And Dylan turned on their heel and looked at me and said, that's what I've been telling you. And I had this moment of, oh, got it. And so often when people ask me, how do I get better at using they, them pronouns? My answer is always, I'm not the best person to ask necessarily, because I was better at using it because I had a child in my home who used it, right? So I was practicing every day, all day. And I was also very fortunate that as a parent, I was able to observe how much more affirmed Dylan became, how much their anxiety decreased. I mean, just overall, their overall well-being changed when they were in a space where they were being affirmed. And so it was really easy. It made it easy for me to practice that. It made it easy for me to stick with that and advocate and educate around this. But the advice that I do use for anybody out there who's wondering, who maybe is like, I have family members or friends or people who use they, them pronouns, and I'm not that comfortable with it. The best thing that I always say is to practice it as often as you can, whether they're in the room or not. Always gender somebody correctly. And I would practice sometimes with, when I was working as a youth program director, I would practice by saying it out loud in my car when I was driving by myself, practice, but have note cards in front of me, have conversations with people and make sure that we were holding each other accountable with colleagues and such. We were holding each other accountable and correcting if we were ever misgendering somebody. So it really is just practicing until it becomes comfortable, and recognizing that it's important. It's so important to get it right, but also that practice is the only way. Do you have any tips or tricks?
One thing is when you don't know someone, which most people do this, but there are some people, when you don't know someone, sometimes you will automatically refer to they, them. Or when you're talking about a group of people, just use example sentences like, well, he's driving the car. Just like use example sentences like that, but change the he, him, or she, her pronouns to they, them, which is a very easy practice. It's just taking sentences that you may say every day with very gendered pronouns and replacing them with they, them.
And I would say, and when in doubt, I think to your point, I didn't even say this earlier, but when in doubt, using they, them pronouns. So when we're not aware of how somebody identifies, using they, them pronouns. And as Dylan said, we do that all the time. Like if I said, my friend is coming over later, somebody might say, oh, what time will he or she be here? But more than likely they'd say, oh, what time will they be here? So we do that often when we don't know, but we are really practicing. That kind of goes along with degendering our language across the board. And as I mentioned, degendering our language can be, not only is it a great way to affirm people, but it can be a much simpler way as well.
I think Amy and I could just talk to you for hours because the two of you are so educational, but I want to make sure we're getting to some of the questions that people are asking on YouTube. Somebody asked if you, you said that you use the term othering when you were doing your presentation. Can you explain what that means?
Absolutely. So othering is a term that I use sometimes when I'm thinking about how we make people feel different, right? So othering to me means excluding, using exclusionary language, or using language that differentiates them, highlights marginalization. Othering, I think of as a form of microaggression. I think microaggression is kind of a buzz phrase, but it's a very real thing, right? It's the ways that we unintentionally, I want to say cause harm or unintentionally make people feel uncomfortable, particularly people in marginalized groups. And so I use the phrase othering when I'm thinking of how do we create the most inclusive space for creating, and that goes for all the isms, right? That goes for not just LGBTQ plus folks, but of course we're looking at racism and ageism and sexism and on and on. How are we making the most inclusive space we can create, and who is being othered in this space? Who is being treated differently in this space?
One thing I'm going to point out at my school, and I'm not going to call out my school for this, but I am. My school has an all gender bathroom, which seems great. They have one all gender bathroom. It is upstairs away from almost every classroom. And they have come up to students and been like, this is just for transgender people. Now, they probably think, well, this is for the better. But most of the time, it's not. Most of the times, transgender people do want to go into the bathroom that they feel like they should be allowed to go into. And if they don't want to go into neither the female or the male restroom, then or just take down the female and the male restrooms. They're
really progressive options.
There's no point of separating them. But if you feel like you have to separate them, make more inclusive restrooms that everyone's allowed to use, and not just because that is othering. That is like, well, there's male, there's female, and then there's other. But their bathroom is going to be really hard to use, and there's only going to be one of them. That is a really good example of othering.
And I think that having that bathroom designated, actually, I've talked about this with their school, having that bathroom designated as being just for transgender use, the reason why that becomes a problem is because every time a youth uses it, they're being forced to out themselves as transgender. If they had the single stall option and it was available, a variety of people have different reasons why they may prefer a single stall restroom. There are religious reasons, there are accessibility reasons. And if that was a bathroom that students were able to use and didn't have to necessarily say, I am transgender, so therefore I'm using this bathroom, that would be less othering. So that's a good example.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I know bathrooms are really loaded. I'll also point out that we're in North Carolina, so bathrooms have been an especially loaded topic down here presently. What other questions do you have for us?
Thanks. That was a great example, Dylan. The next question we have from viewers is, as a concerned parent, what's the best way to inquire about a teen's romantic relationships? Are they dating someone? Who is it, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. And also so tricky, I think, to navigate. I think that inquiring is a challenging thing because we all know that if we ask, often they're going to push back. So what I often encourage families that I've worked with, or families who've asked me questions similar to this, is to keep things really broad and open and never make assumptions about who our children will be dating. And that starts at a very, very early age. And that starts when they're tiny, not assuming. We talk about cis-normative, heteronormative society. So assuming that the default is that our children will be heterosexual, assuming that the default is that our children will be cisgender, meaning identifying with the gender they were assigned at birth. And so trying to use more broad and inclusive language. So using language like partner instead of boyfriend or girlfriend, having conversations like, being very broad and who they may date, who they may be attracted to, how they themselves may identify. And as for inquiring, I think that some tactics that I've seen work really well are when parents just say, I'm, again, kind of going back to that affirming language, I'm here to support you and affirm you. I'm very interested. I think naming that, I'm very curious and interested. And if you're having romantic relationships or having feelings, there's lots to navigate there. And I'd really love to help you navigate that and have that conversation with you. But I'm recognizing that this could be an uncomfortable thing to talk about with your parent. But I just want you to know that these lines of communication are open, and however you'd like to talk to me. And then again, kind of going back to the do's and don'ts, not being shocked when they do start to talk about it, and always bracing ourselves for the fact that sometimes we may hear things that, is brand new information, or that, maybe we need to look up and do some Googling. And always remembering that we can pause the conversation and say, thanks so much for sharing this with me. I need to do a little more research on this or a little more reading about this. I'm going to go to Gender Spectrum or Glisten or the LGBT Center of Central PA's page and do a little more reading and come back and have this conversation. That's the approach that I've often seen work. And I don't know, what would you say?
I mean, yeah, not even with like straight children that for a fact are straight. Even then, don't pressure people into telling you about their relationships. And that doesn't even have to do with children, just in general. Mm-hmm. If you have a friend, a family member, a child, don't be like, I want to hear everything about this person. Let them talk about it as they want to. And like my mom said, don't be surprised when they do start talking about it. They might want to hide it, and then they will see queer couples at school and they're like, wow, maybe I can talk to people about this. Maybe I can be a little bit more open about this. So don't be surprised when that starts happening.
And I'll also say too, another thing that I should have mentioned when we were talking about representation and visual cues earlier, genderspectrum.org has a lot of lists of great books. So purchasing or checking out books from the library on different types of relationships and having those available, whether you talk about it with your youth, your kid or not, but just having it on the shelf. We also have never lived in a better time for representation, positive representation in media. So there are wonderful shows out, like Love Victor is a great show on Hulu. Heartstopper is a personal family favorite that we've just watched recently that show really healthy LGBTQ plus relationships and are family friendly for like adolescents and up. But like great shows and things that parents and youth can watch and bond together over. Yeah.
One that is, I think it's on Netflix, and I think it is in like not the kids like section, but it you could easily watch it with not like toddlers, but like people 7 or 8 years old, is One Day at a Time. It's on Netflix. One of the main characters is gay, but it's also an activist. So she explains a lot of things too.
Yeah, so I think there's great family-friendly media representation right now too. So there's lots of good access to be able to watch things, talk about things, explore things, and just leave lines of communication open.
So here's a question from one of our viewers. The person mentioned that, it used to be very popular for people who refer to a female child who dressed masculine as a tomboy. Can you explain the difference between non-binary and a tomboy?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So typically tomboy is referring to gender expression. So we're kind of going back and thinking about our genderbread person. So gender expression was kind of more than just dress, a manner of dress. It can also be a manner of, behavior, speaking, things like that. So this is gender expression, which doesn't necessarily tell us, again, anything about a person's gender identity. So gender identity being different from somebody's gender expression. And I think that that's actually, when I talk about speaking with adults and adults saying, wait a minute, if I'd known being non-binary, maybe that's how I identify. But I always thought, and often that's the thing they cite, I always thought I was just a tomboy, or they always told me I was just a tomboy. Well, there are certainly people, people assigned female at birth, young women who have much more masculine, what we think of as masculine gender expression, but they still very much identify as a woman. The way I always think about it, Dylan's poking me under the table, so I think they've got something to say, but the way I always think about it is, no matter how I'm dressed, no matter what manner of clothing I have on or how I'm expressing myself to the world, I identify as a woman. That feels right to me, and whatever gender expression I have doesn't change how I see myself internally. So gender identity and non-binary identities being an internal sense of their own gender, regardless of how, there are some non-binary folks who have maybe a very feminine gender expression, or any variation on that.
One thing about gender expression, especially, and just in general, and with anybody, separate gender from objects like clothing and toys and stuff like that is the easiest. Like tomboy, that is referring to usually a girl who likes wearing like jeans and shirts and not dresses. But separating gender from clothing and everything helps people figure out who they are, but also feel more comfortable. Because there might be girls who do like wearing jeans, which I can admit, jeans are comfortable, and t-shirts and stuff like that, but they don't want to be referred to as a tomboy because they don't want to be seen as a boy and stuff like that. But the best way to do this is because a lot of parents will be like, well, that's a girl shirt, well, that's a boy shirt, so does this mean you're transgender and you're a boy now? But the easiest way to go about this is inanimate objects don't have gender.
Yeah.
They are objects, which means if I'm wearing this doesn't mean I'm a girl. This doesn't mean I'm a boy. It's just what I want to wear. If your little daughter is playing with trucks, that doesn't mean that they're transgender. It just means that they like trucks.
Yeah.
It's separating gender from objects. It's a great way to help people and just a way to live in general.
Yeah. I see.
Our next question is, how can you support youth when they're unsure of what terms to use for themselves? What sources would you recommend? And you have mentioned a lot of different sources throughout your talk, and I was hoping that you could send us kind of a list that we could include in the notes for the session, also so that they're down there for people to copy.
Absolutely, I'll send a bunch of resources. I have that ready to go, so I'll get that out so it can be included in the notes. And I would say that, Dylan mentioned one of the things that they were saying is you don't have to label yourself, but we always talk about the labels paradox. So I want to mention that not only, a lot of people say, well, why do we have so many labels? We're siloing people, or we're trying too hard. Labels can also be very unifying. So as I mentioned too, it's a labels paradox. Labels can hurt, labels can help. So sometimes labeling can feel, again, going back to that word othering, like labeling can feel othering or exclusionary, or like I must pick exactly which box I check, but it also can feel unifying. It can feel like, oh, there are other people like me. There are other people who think like me. However, I think that, kind of to Dylan's point, remembering that you don't have to pick that it's something that you can continue to explore. That adolescence is very naturally a time of exploration anyway, exploring where our boundaries are, what we're comfortable with, what feels right to us. It's such a typical developmental time for that anyway, and that this is just one facet of that. But I also think that I mentioned Trevor Project, gender spectrum, and listen. Those are probably the three that come to mind first. But also so many groups, as Dylan mentioned, there are LGBT centers all over the country. We obviously have a great one in Central PA. And so many of these things are operating, so many of these programs are operating virtually now as well, which has been a really great thing for youth who are in more rural areas, maybe aren't able to access in-person groups, where they're able to log on now and virtually attend a group and speak to other people like them. Sometimes the Q in LGBTQ is also thought of as questioning. Again, more commonly known as queer now, but sometimes thought as questioning. And questioning is a very valid place to be. It's a stage that everybody has been in at some point, but especially all LGBTQ plus folks have at some point gone through a questioning stage of figuring out their identity.
One thing I would also like to point out is unlabeled. I know a few people who are unlabeled, and it's kind of the same thing as questioning, where they're not sure where they're at. So they're just unlabeled. So you will also hear it as questioning or unlabeled. And they have flags for that, just for people who don't know what they are. And people may say, well, that's homophobic or stuff like that. Most of the time it's internalized homophobia, and they were raised with, oh, well, being gay is bad. So they have to figure out themselves, like, what is going on with them, or do they only know gay and straight? So they might be unlabeled, and that's just because they don't know what's going on, really.
And I would also add too that, as I mentioned, we're moving into Pride Month. Pride Month starts June 1st, and there are tons and tons of Pride activities and festivities in the area. All families, all different groups of people going to Pride events can be a great way to help youth connect, see different representation for different families. Even if you're in a family that maybe you don't know, or nobody in your family identifies as LGBTQ+, or you don't know if they do yet, it can be a great way just to show people a variety of different families, a variety of different configurations, a variety of different gender expressions. It can be a really neat family bonding activity and way to help youth find or understand, just open up their minds to different identities and such.
Lindsey, I know you're going to send some resources to us later, but for people watching right now, if we can turn the conversation back over to Dylan for a minute, if you'd feel comfortable putting them in the chat of our Zoom session, I can pull them out and send them to Lauren, who's monitoring our YouTube chat, and she can put them in. That way, the people who are watching now can copy them down and have them ready to go. So if you don't mind doing that, we'll get it going that way. So Dylan or Lindsey, if you want to jump in, a lot of adults, this is a new thing for them, and they don't know what to say. They don't know what to do other than to love the youth in their life that may come to them with this, this realization. So what can you do to support them other than the things that your mom said about congratulating them and thank them for sharing? What kind of resources are helpful? I mean, should you suggest going to a counselor, or are there things to read? I mean, you've got all these resources right at your disposal, but so many kids don't. So what would you suggest parents or any adult do to help support LGBTQ youth in their lives?
I think not being like, well, do you want to see a therapist, or let's talk to your counselor about this, mainly just because that may make the youth feel like it's wrong and that they have to change. A therapist and anything like a counselor is good for everyone, but it's kind of that same way of othering. You don't want to be like, well, now that you've come out, maybe you should go to therapy and stuff like that. But good resources are giving them places that they can figure out, that they can find out more about, even if you don't know much about anything that they're telling you. Giving them resources is another great way to comfort them. It is amazing. Even with the support that I have, it's still really nice for my mom to be like, hey, I found this new place for trans youth. Do you want to check it out? Even parents who do know a lot about it and parents who don't, it's nice to hear that they are thinking about you and they're thinking about like trans and queer resources. Another thing is representation in media and shows and movies and books. It's not just like, oh, you're gay, here's some books with gay characters. But if you know that your kid likes horror movies, you could be like, oh, I found this really cool horror movie, and the main character happens to be transgender. That is also another great resource. It's just thinking about them and giving them resources and things that with representation, because as I said before, it's nice to know that there are other people experiencing what you're experiencing. Or I don't really want to use this phrase, but other people like you. There are other people who have the same gender as you and have the same sexual orientation as you. Seeing that in media is really nice for youth, especially.
So I think because of the settings with the presentation, wasn't able to access the chat. So I just sent an email with just copied and pasted. You got it. Copied and pasted a ton of resources.
I already forwarded it. So I figured, I saw there was no chat too. So I'm like, okay, she's probably emailing it. Lauren, I was just texting Lauren to tell her to post it. So thanks.
Perfect. Yeah. I think that your point about representation, and actually in the resources, the last piece of that, I put a link to Disclosure, the movie, which Disclosure is a great documentary that actually addresses specifically how trans folks have been represented, transgender people have been represented in the media. It's both positive and negative, and it talks a lot about how the negative tropes that have happened over the years, how harmful they've been. It's a great process. That's not necessarily something that folks need to watch right away with their young folks, but it is a really important documentary for people to watch and process through, kind of unlearning our own biases, where our implicit bias is, and how much of that has been shaped. If we had more time to spend together, we would do some talking about gender messages across the board, the gender messages we've received, and especially the gender messages that we've received from media and how that shaped us. So Disclosure is an excellent film, and there is a link to more information on it as well.
We could talk about this for hours. The two of you are great. And I'm sorry, Dylan, but I really think you're like 35 years old. You are so cool. We've gotten so many comments about how great your conversation is.
This is actually all unrehearsed too. They very last minute were like, yeah, can I come sit in? Also, can I make a note since I just misgendered you? So Dylan used they and he for a long time, and I just used he to refer to them. And so I want to say that if and when you misgender somebody, I'll use myself as an example. How do you do it?
Don't make it obvious is the first thing. You may want to make it very obvious because it seems like, oh, I did something wrong. I'm trying to make it obvious that I'm not homophobic and I didn't mean to do that. But making it obvious will sometimes make it worse. Or if people around, they may not want people around to know that they're trans, and you making a big deal out of it can make it worse. Also, kind of in the same way, making it seem they're like, oh, that's my fault. I'm so sorry. Or some people will be like, oh, well, you came out recently, so sorry. Which is a good, not excuse, but good way, a good reason to misgender people is, as my mom said, sometimes it gets a little bit of getting used to, for sure. But just subtly, like she did, she went he, they, not being like he, sorry, no, they. Making a big deal out of it, it's really can cause a lot of stress to use.
And it can put the onus back on the person who's now been misgendered to comfort you. You know, like I know I've done that to myself before. I've been like, oh, I'm so sorry. I meant to say, I know your pronouns are he now, are they now. I've been practicing this. But then it puts them in a position to then be like, no, it's okay. It's not a big deal. You know, that's how they're comforting me. So the best way to do it, with any microaggression, really, whenever we catch it, quickly apologize, correct it, move on. So they, and move on, just like that.
And people are, people who are trying to make an effort to get it right, I think that says a lot. You may not get it right all the time, but at least if you're making an effort, that's important. So.
And I always tell people it is embarrassing and uncomfortable to use somebody's wrong name or misgender them, but it's important to know, I do this for a living and this is my child and I just did it. So it's important to know that it does happen. It's not a question of if it happens, it's when it will happen. And just remember to correct yourself and move on and keep practicing, because the best apology is always changed behavior.
I'm a trans youth, and there have been so many times where I've accidentally misgendered people or dead named people, which
Dead names using somebody's former name.
dead naming people is what it's referred as, is if people come out as trans or non-binary. Most of the time, not all the time, it's fine to not want to change your name. I know someone on social media who changed their name, who didn't change their name, it's just spelled differently. But dead naming is when you're using the name that they had before they transitioned. And it's 100% fine to not want to change your name. Be like, well, I kind of like my name now.
Yeah, there's so many different ways to be, infinite ways, as we mentioned. Do you have any other questions or thoughts?
I don't think we had any other questions, but I think we definitely have to have the two of you back because there's so much to uncover here. And I think as we all continue to try to educate ourselves, we would be doing a great service to have you back and join us again sometime.
Well, we are so grateful for the opportunity to talk with everybody. And and this is why very unrehearsed. We haven't done a training together in years. Dylan just popped out of the room and said, yeah, I'll join you tonight. So here we are. So I'm glad that they were with me tonight. I'm glad that they were able to answer questions. And I want to invite everybody to look over those resources, to reach out to the LGBT Center of Central PA if you have any further questions or thoughts or comments. And to know that, as I mentioned, there's a lot here. There's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to process through. Some of this conversation may have brought up big feelings for people, and that's okay. It's just important that we continue to stay in conversation and remember that we're all working towards, of course, doing the right thing and supporting the youth and recognizing how vitally important it is that we're supporting youth right now. Always.
Yeah. Just like it's a journey for the youth who are trying to realize how they identify, it's also a journey for the adults who want to support them. So we will stick together to figure it out.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you both.
Thank you both so much. This was really terrific. I just want to close by saying, please tell your friends. This recording will be living on the Dairy Township's YouTube page forever and ever. So we want lots of people to see it. So please share the link and let people know that it's here. And also, this is the last session we're going to be having for this current season. So keep up with our Facebook page. And if you've registered through Eventbrite, you'll receive emails about upcoming programs. But we're going to be meeting soon to plan next season, which will begin in September. And so we're going to take the summer off, put together some great programming, and come back. And
we should invite people too to put their ideas, send us messages on Facebook if they have topics that they'd like us to explore. We'd be happy to do that. So
yes,
and we want to thank the Hershey Company again for sending the goodies to you. We hope you enjoy them. And also thanks to the Hershey Public Library. They put together a great reading list, which I know Brian will be happy to share in the posting on the YouTube video, and we'll put it on Facebook again as well so that everybody can see that. So
excellent.
Anything else you can think of, Amy?
I think that's it.
All right. Thanks again to Lindsey and Dylan.
You.
And thanks to all of you. Brian Blausch, thank you for running everything so wonderfully again tonight. And we'll be back in a couple of months.